Now we are starting the keynote lecture. The keynote lecture speaker is Nadia Odunayo, the founder and the CEO of StoryGraph, and also operates Speaker Line EU, and jointly developed Ignition Works for the development of the home products and the software consulting business, and also it supported the operation of the cloud platform of the larger companies. When she was with Pivotal, she self-taught the course at Makers Academy in London. The topic today is a case of the missing method, a Ruby mystery story.
それではナディアお願い
Hey Nadia, please.
します。
こんにちは。私の話にようこそ。
Good morning, welcome.
For you. Do you have a side hustle? Something to bring in a little extra money each month? I do. At the time of this story, by day, I was a product manager for a software team in a bank. But by night, I'm a private investigator. And what is it I investigate? Ruby crimes. No, not jewel theft, the programming language. Why did I decide to go into private investigating? There's been rumors of a shady mastermind causing havoc and confusion amongst Ruby developers worldwide, with his constant meddling in the source code. I wanted to help put a stop to it. I decided that I couldn't do this job under my normal name. I needed to protect my identity. So I chose Deirdre Bug, D for short. Why? Only for the sole purpose of making this joke. And today I want to tell you about one of my more memorable cases. The case of the missing method. Chapter 1. I was sitting alone, bored, in my office. Well, really my flat. When the doorbell rang, and it was Mike. He didn't look too happy. Let me tell you a bit more about Mike. Mike was an acquaintance of mine. We had some mutual friends. We saw each other out and about now and again. He was 24 years old, a junior Ruby developer, and he got excited about test-driven development. He was applying for an apprenticeship at the prestigious Ruby Institute of Professionals. He'd managed to get through all of the stages, beating hundreds of applicants, and he was now at the final stage, and it was happening in 2 days. There were 2 people left fighting for this last spot, himself and a woman named Jenny. Jenny was 27 years old, also a junior Ruby developer, and she loved all things Rails. She's also Mike's best friend and housemate. They had quit their consulting jobs at the same time to enter into the world of tech, and not long after that, they also decided to live together. For the interview, they'd agreed to work together to prepare so that they each had the best shot. May the best person win, they said. So they'd been asked to research a series of topics that they were going to be quizzed on. One of them was method lookup. And they had assigned this topic to Jenny. And here was the reason that Mike had come to me. Something doesn't add up in Jenny's notes, he said. But Jenny's been so stressed and panicked, rather uncharacteristically, by this interview that she won't hear me out. She's convinced that she's right, and she says that they don't have time for Mike's doubts. Mike tells me that if I can help him find the answer to this mystery, he'll have what he needs to confidently correct Jenny's notes and save them from interview failure. So he reaches into a satchel and draws out some sheets of paper. They're Jenny's supposedly flawed notes. So I ask him to walk me through them. So Jenny's got these boxes to represent the concept of a Ruby object. All objects have a label called class, and this acts as a reference to the parent class of the object in question. Some objects are instance objects, and the class label for them refers to another Ruby object of type class. An object of type class has its own class label, and all objects of type class also have a methods label. And this points to a table of all the methods that instances of that class can call. Then there were some handwritten notes beside the diagram that said, any class you define is an instance of a class object called class. So if we were to write class cake in our code, we're creating a class object named cake, and it's an instance of another class object. The name of that object is class. So all classes are of type class with a capital C. Then Jenny had this code in her notes. There was a class cake. It had an instance method called tasty, which returned true if the flavor of the cake was carrot. Then there was a class method called edible, which always returned true. And then Jenny had written, imagine we had a cake instance called carrot. This is what the method lookup chain would look like. We have a carrot object. This would have a class label. Its class label would point to a cake object, and the cake object would have its own class label. It would also have a methods label. And this would point to a table which had all the methods that instances of cake could call. So the tasty method would be in there. Then the class label for cake would point to a Ruby object of type class with a capital C, and it would have its own methods label. And this would point to a table with the entry edible. And Jenny had written beside that diagram, a method definition always comes from an object's class. And at this point, Mike shook his head in frustration. It cannot be that the edible method lives on the parent class for all classes, he said. Can I show you something? He asks me. May I jump on your computer? I agree. He goes over to my desk, opens up terminal, enters pry, and loads in the cake class from Jenny's notes. First, he shows that the class of cake is indeed class with a capital C. And then he searches through all of the instance methods of class for edible, and it returns false. What a mystery. I'm stumped, and I'm not sure how to proceed with this. But Dee loves a challenge. And if anyone can do it, Dee can. And this meant a lot to Mike. He was prepared to pay me a lot of money. So I agreed to take on the case. Chapter 2. Ever heard of Google? Or, if you care about people like me not spying on you, maybe you use DuckDuckGo. Well, when I'm Dee, I don't believe in these tools. I don't trust them. And it's no coincidence that with this approach, I've become the best Ruby private investigator the industry has to offer. But what did I have? Books. Books, books, and more books. And I spent a whole day quickly skimming a load of books, but I couldn't find anything useful. So I decided to form a hypothesis and go from there. I said that the edible method, while not in cake, must be somewhere in the ancestry tree. What is the ancestry tree? Well, it shows all of the classes and modules that a class inherits from. So all of the possible places that the method could come from. So I constructed this where method to help me search the tree. It took 2 parameters, an object and a method you were looking for in relation to that object. And it searched within an object's class's ancestors to find the class where the instance methods of that class, and only that class, so not including the ancestors, included the method that we were looking for. And then it was time to give it a go. I thought I'd start with an easy example to check that the method was working. So I created an instance of cake called carrot, and I checked that the instance method tasty showed up on cake in relation to carrot. And then it was the moment of truth. The edible method had to be somewhere in relation to cake. What? Nowhere? At all? What a mystery. So at this point, I'm confused. And I think that it's time for some fresh air, a change of scenery. So I decide to head to my favorite co-working space. And here I feel at home. I'm surrounded by people hacking away, and I quickly settle down at one desk. Given my naturally inquisitive nature, my eyes couldn't help but stray to the screen of the guy next to me. He was playing around in IRB with something called object space. It looked interesting, so I couldn't help but ask myself, and I asked him, "What's that?" He said, "It's a way that you can interact with all of the live objects within a Ruby session. For example, with object space count objects and then the symbol T class, you can count all of the live objects that you have in a Ruby session." So I decided to have a little play in IRB. So I start a session and I count up all of the live objects. 936. Then I think, let me create a class and check that the number goes up to 937. 938? Let me try that again. $940? What a mystery. But just then, the phone rang. It was my friend wondering where I was. I'd completely forgotten that I'd agreed to go to a tech lecture with her. I was anxious that I didn't have much time, but I'd been cancelling a lot on this friend lately, putting my investigative duties first. So I decided that on this occasion, I should make some time for her, and I rushed out of the door. Chapter 3. So I remember that I turned up just in time. The lecture was about a language called Smalltalk. I wasn't that interested. After all, I only had space in my heart for Ruby. But I decided to listen in any case. The lecturer spoke about how Smalltalk had been created in 1970, and that it had led to the birth of the object-oriented programming paradigm. But I couldn't concentrate for much longer. I couldn't stop thinking about my play with object space. Each time I'd created one class, and yet 2 objects had been added to the session. "Psst, pay attention," whispered my friend. So I looked up to see the lecturer asking, What is the class of a class in Smalltalk? And I saw that she had some code on the screen. She had an object called Polygon, and the class of that was called Polygon class. And then she'd asked the system what the class of Polygon class was. And it returned metaclass. The lecturer reiterated the class of a class in Smalltalk is called a metaclass. In fact, all of the languages Smalltalk inspired have their own concept of metaclasses, including Objective-C, Java, Python, and Ruby. Something clicked. One class, two objects. So I made my apologies to my soon-to-be no longer friend and rushed out of the door home. I decided to try my luck, but I knew that would be too easy. So I thought, let me look at all the methods that appeared on Cake. So this was rather overwhelming. So I thought, why don't I filter this list down to the methods that feature the word class? Now, two methods stood out for me: superclass and singleton class. I first decided to remind myself of the ancestry tree because I knew that the edible method did not appear in any of these places. Then I thought I'd try out superclass. It returned object, so I knew this wasn't the right answer since object appeared in Cake's ancestry tree. Then I tried singleton class. Ooh, this was something I hadn't seen before. And when I looked at the ancestors for Cake's singleton class, I saw 3 new objects that I hadn't seen before. Perhaps edible was hiding here. So I decided to edit my where method. And instead of looking amongst the ancestors of an object's class, this time, I'd search amongst the ancestors from the object's singleton class. So I'd be looking within the new classes that I just discovered. And then it was time to give it a go. Result. And I thought, let me check that what I thought was happening was actually happening. And eventually, I confirmed that the edible method did indeed live on Cake's singleton class. Case closed. Chapter 4. So at this point, I was delighted and super excited to share this news with Mike. So I gave him a call. And when he answered, I say, "Can I come over to your house? I've solved the case." He's excited. He says, "Of course, come round." And he says he'll have the notes ready and waiting. But although I'd solved the case for Mike, I'm still not satisfied. I just discovered a whole new concept in the language that I hadn't heard of before. What are singleton classes? So instead of going directly to Mike's, I decided to take a detour and visit a friend. Her name's Ellen. She's 43, a freelance developer, and she regularly contributes to the Ruby language codebase. So I proceed to tell Ellen all about the case. And when I'm done, I ask her, "So, what are these singleton classes all about?" She tells me how they're hidden classes created internally behind the scenes in Ruby. And they're there to hold methods defined only for one particular object. So, take your instance carrot of the Cake class. Its singleton class would hold methods specific to carrot only and not to another instance, say red velvet. Okay, I ask Ellen, given they're working away behind the scenes, when does knowing about them become useful? Ellen thought for a while, and then she told me about one of her recent clients. They were called Budgeting Inc., and they were building a clever, artificial intelligence, machine learning, personal finance tool for small business owners. They were expanding globally, and they needed to roll out slightly unique versions of their software for each new city that they entered. Ellen told me that when she first looked at their code base, she was horrified. Different developers had been responsible for each new city, and it looked like they were trying out a new approach each time for naming things, testing things, designing interfaces. There was a lot of duplication. Sometimes it was obvious, and sometimes it was hidden. Therefore, there was lots of wasted time on development, because the developers were reinventing the wheel and often doing a bad job. So there were a lot of bugs. Some things were copied, some things were left out, and it was difficult to see what was important. The developers were unhappy. They had a lot of tiresome work, and their cognitive load was high. And the product owner was also unhappy, because delivery was either very slow, or things were spun up quickly and were bug-ridden. Things were missed out. Ellen wasn't quite sure what to do. And then she said that she decided to create a DSL, a domain-specific language. She asked me if I knew what she was talking about. It's a mystery to me, Ellen. You're going to have to explain, I said. She beckoned me over to her computer and said that she wanted to show me a basic version. She opened up a prize session and input this class. It was called City Instance. It had a class method called construct, which took a block. Then a variable called city was defined, which called out to initialize via the new keyword. Then we called instance eval on city, passing in the block we passed into construct. Ellen said I should pay attention to this line. It would prove to be important later. Then we returned city. We had an attribute reader called taxes. Then we had the initialize method. This had an instance variable called taxes, which was set up as an empty array. Then we had a method called tax, which took in a name parameter, and we put the new tax into the taxes collection. Then Ellen created a city instance called New York. And she added a couple of taxes. And then she printed out those taxes. And there we have it, Ellen says. That's a very simple DSL. And we can quickly spin up these lightweight city objects. But, she said, imagine if we also had other properties, like a list of banks or finance schemes. Or imagine if we had more information about each of the properties. So maybe the taxes also had information about rates and thresholds. Well, using this simple framework, it wouldn't be hard to extend the city instance class to create incrementally more complex city objects. Well, imagine taking that to the next level, said Ellen. Imagine interacting with the city instance class in the same way on the command line, but instead of just creating variables in our prize session, we're spinning up a new subclass of city and other related models for each tax, scheme, or bank that you list. Ellen explains how this was the sort of thing that she produced for Budgeting Inc., a DSL that allowed for quick and easy scaffolding of each new city subclass and any related classes. So, she said, now we know how to spin up identical city instances with different names and different taxes. What about if one city had a quirk? So she asked me to think of a place in the UK. So I chose Bath, since that was the location of my first ever case. So Ellen created Bath and added a tax. Then she asked me to think of something that made people in the UK very unhappy. She didn't like my suggestion of Brexit and said, let's focus on the fact that it rains all the time. And when it does, the government calls an amnesty and clears all of the taxes. So she printed out Bath's taxes, then it rains, and the government calls a rainy day amnesty. And now all the taxes are gone. Now, remember our friends in New York? Well, they want to take part in this rainy day amnesty too. So next time it rains, they call one. But it doesn't work. They get undefined method rainy day amnesty for a city instance object with all of these characters. And what are these characters? Well, watch this, says Ellen. And she calls singleton class on New York, and I see that it's the same object returned. So when we enter the realm of DSLs and call methods like instance eval, we leverage the existence of singleton classes. Because instance eval stores any method declarations passed in via the block on an object's singleton class. Hold on to that thought though, said Ellen. Let's take a step back to the high level for a moment. She said that creating a DSL like this enabled the developers to spin up each new instance effortlessly. She explained how she managed to abstract out the key similarities between any city. So the developers now had a frictionless way, via the command line, of spinning up the foundation that they needed. And the code was better maintained, because all of that scaffolding had been well tested. Ellen had dealt with it once, and none of the other developers had to worry about it. They could now focus on the interesting bits, the customization that was required for each new city. The scope was much more refined. So now, the developers were happy. Interacting with this system was a joy, and it was easier to have a high-level overview of the whole domain in their head, purely by reading the documentation for the DSL. And the product owner was delighted also. There were far fewer bugs, delivery was faster, and she could also speak in the same language that the developers were by expressing new requirements within the terminology of the DSL. But let's go back to singleton classes, says Ellen. Why is knowing about them useful? Well, one of the main reasons that I was able to complete this project to a high standard was because I understood exactly where I was defining methods. Because once you enter the realm of dynamically creating classes and methods on singletons, the class hierarchy and method lookup gets far more interesting. You might be getting funny error messages, and you need to be able to spot where singleton methods are involved and where they're hiding, because it can save you from a lot of headache. But beware, said Ellen. I've been going on about DSLs, but they're not the answer to everything. If you've got complex repeated business rules, and you need to customize behavior in specific instances, you can consider DSLs as an option. But even then, approach with caution. But you don't even need to be writing DSLs for it to be beneficial for you to understand the basics of how they work. If you're using Rails, you see DSLs every single day. So Ellen went to the Rails Guide's website, and she showed me how active record migrations were carried out via a DSL. When you specify what tables that you want created and the format of each column, you're using a DSL. And when you specify how a Rails app should handle HTTP requests, that's also done via a DSL. I'd just been doing this stuff by rote. I didn't stop to think about what was happening behind the scenes every time I typed the resources keyword into my config roots RB file. And there's more of these, said Ellen. So when people talk about Rails magic, it's not really magic. It's really a collection of well-written DSLs. And then Ellen said, I hope you're TDDing all of the time. And I said, of course. What do you take me for? And she said, well, RSpec, with its describe, context, and it blocks, those are all DSLs too. And so with all of these Rails and RSpec DSLs, knowing about singleton classes can help. Because you might find yourself in a tricky problem. You can't make head or tail of it, particularly if you inherit a code base. So if you're seeing a funny bug to do with methods, you never know. Singleton classes might be the answer. And having them as part of your suite of debugging questions is useful. So I was feeling really leveled up by the end of this conversation. And armed with this new knowledge, I headed over to Mike's. But when I arrived, I found a Mike who had tears in his eyes. He'd obviously been recently crying. He had crumpled pieces of paper in his hand. He raised his arm towards me, offering me the papers. They looked exactly the same as the method lookup notes of Jenny's that he had brought me the day before. I took the notes from him and looked through them. I couldn't see what was wrong. They looked the same. We had the carrot object with its class label. This pointed to a cake object. This had its own class label. It had the methods label with the table with tasty in it. And the class label pointed to a class object with the methods label that pointed to a table with edible in it. But wait. It didn't say class like last time. This time, it said cake singleton. And as Mike saw me notice this difference, he fell to his knees and broke down in tears. Jenny knew about singleton classes all along, he cried. He'd gone into her room to find the notes in advance of my arrival, and this was the copy that he had found. Jenny was so desperate to secure the job for herself that she had set out to intentionally mislead Mike in the hope that he would fail a whole section of the interview and therefore look underprepared. I, for one, was disappointed in myself. I'd been so focused on the main villain, the shady mastermind, that I'd failed to spot a villain right under my nose. My best friend tried to sabotage me, Mike cried. At this point, Mike started wailing again, saying that he wasn't going to go to the RIP interview tomorrow. Nonsense, I said. You can't give up now. I crouched down next to him, gave him a comforting pat on the shoulder, and I said, you can do this. And I have just the thing to help set you apart from Jenny. He looked up hopeful. Have you heard of DSLs? I asked him. And I proceeded to tell him everything that Ellen had just shared with me. And although Mike still looked devastated as I left him, I had confidence that I had inspired him with the power of singleton classes, that he'd pull himself together and go and secure the RIP internship for himself. 2 months later, I managed to drag myself to a Ruby hack night. When I arrive, I'm milling about, enjoying the free food and drink, when I hear a couple of people whispering in the corner. Ooh, she's Ruby famous, one of them says. I look across the room, and who do I see? Ellen. I walk over, we catch up. I tell her that I've been reflecting on the case of the missing method and my takeaways. That singleton classes are there to hold methods defined for one particular object. And that when you understand them, it opens up a whole new world of Ruby, dynamically creating classes and methods on the fly in more complex applications via DSLs. But, I said, I still feel as if day to day I can get by ignoring them. So, I asked Ellen, do I really have to care about them at all? Not really, she says. Like you say, if you're using DSLs, then yes, you must understand them. And they do underpin popular frameworks like Rails. But day to day, you can get by. However, she says, understanding why singletons are there, I think, is super interesting and empowering. Think of the Ruby core team. They wanted to keep things as straightforward and as simple as possible. By simple, I mean minimize special cases. Aim for having one way, one pattern for explaining how anything works. How consistent can we get things? They continually asked. So think about what's consistent in the realm of Ruby methods. Well, all methods in Ruby are defined in only one of two places: a normal class object or a singleton class. And every method in Ruby is really an instance method. A method lookup always starts with a singleton class. So class methods don't have any fundamentally different behavior. What we call class methods are really instance methods, where the object in question is a class and the method is stored on the class's singleton. So yeah, singleton classes are invisible, but they're everywhere. They are a fundamental part to how Ruby and its method lookup works. So I left the hack night deep in thought. Ellen had inspired me to explore more of Ruby behind the scenes. There was so much here that I didn't know. I had only scratched the surface. And I'd always been a general Ruby private investigator. And I'd been very successful in the field. But perhaps it was time to find a niche and specialize in Ruby internals and reach the next level. Arigato.
Thank you very much. So now we wonder if there are any questions from the floor. If you have questions, please raise your hand. Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much. Can you hear me? Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your wonderful presentation. Thank you. Well, thank you. I have a question. So in your mystery investigation, it seems that the IR Ruby was the approach you mostly used, like an interactive approach. But so, and also IRB have been used. But what if the RB is missing? So you have Ruby, but you do not have the access to RB. And then how can you decipher this kind of mystery? And also in developing process, the Ruby development process, what kind of impact would have if you didn't have the IRB?
I missed the beginning because the volume was too high. I accidentally turned it down. But I think what the summary of the question was having a tool like RIB enabled me to, in this story, crack the case. And what would have been the implication both for this case and also just general development if I didn't have IRB? Well, yeah, I think one of the things that I wanted to demonstrate, one of the lessons I want to get across is we have such a powerful tool like PRI and IRB, and it can really like speed up the feedback loops when you want to test things. So I guess, you know, off the top of my head, without such interactive tools, I guess you're kind of forced to write. You could write little Ruby programs, like just Ruby files, and run the scripts and get the output in your terminal. So I think that might be a way to do it. I'm not sure. I haven't actually played around with. I don't know what the equivalent for something like object space would be. I don't know whether someone else would know, like a method to return what the objects are. Something interesting that I discovered, I don't know if anyone spotted this in the talk. I used PRI for most of it, but for the object space, I switched to IRB. I don't know if anyone spotted that and wondered why, but I realized that PRI, and this is maybe another further investigation, creates a lot of extra objects when you create classes. I think they're like PRI-related ones, so it didn't fit the story, so I had to switch to IRB. But no, I think that, and also just in terms of general development, me personally, I basically use Ruby and Rails all the time, and I love using the console. It's just a way to get a quicker feedback loop, do fun experiments, play around with the language. So I think it just means that being able to experiment and play around just becomes a bit more costly, and also would just be a bit less fun. Thank you.
舞台あっての役
So, thank you very much. So it's like they're listening to you. When you had a perfect stage, and your actors and actresses had a very good spots too. Thank you. Any other questions? No questions at the moment. Yes, and there's someone in front.
Thank you. Thanks for the talk. That was absolutely wonderful. I'd love to know what actually inspired you to kind of put together this story and this presentation, especially in the way that you put it together as well, because it was very interestingly written, and for someone like me who doesn't know the code world that much, I could follow along, which was really cool. But yeah, I'd love to know what inspired you.
Thank you. If anyone doesn't know why I'm laughing, it's because it's my sister asking. And she genuinely doesn't know the answer to this question, so it's a legitimate question. So what inspired me to write this talk? I think the first, I had actually been giving, I knew I wanted to write a technical talk. Every year I try and do a different talk, and I tend to switch between technical and non-technical. And I'd actually done a couple of years of talks on communication and feedback, so I knew I wanted to write something technical and something fun. And one of the things that I spotted from technical talks is I wish that there was a lot more narrative. So I had the concept of some story and like a mystery, but I didn't know what the hook was going to be. And actually, it was when I was reading Ruby Under a Microscope, which is a great book if you've not read it. Whether you're new to Ruby or more experienced, I'm sure you will pick up something about Ruby internals. And Pat had this thing of doing these deep dives or these experiments within tools like IRB, while explaining. So there'd be a chapter, and then he'd say, well, this is how we would discover this. And I actually remembered that it was on the, I could have told you what the definition of singleton classes were before, but did I really understand them? No. And it was when reading one of Pat's experiments where I think it was either object space or some other way that he showed that 2 Ruby objects were created every time a class was created. It clicked in my head finally after like 5 years of Ruby development. And so I was like, that both gave me the idea, but also a method, like a way. It also showed me that when you have this kind of experiment, which is like a story, it's a compelling way to help explain things to other people. And so that was kind of the inspiration, the idea of like reading Pat's book and seeing how he did these mini experiments with IRB. And then I used that, and then I had the idea of the like private investigator, and I fit that around it. So yeah.
Thank you. Glad I could be here to watch it.
Thanks.
ストーリーを考えられてる
So perhaps you enjoyed yourself while you were thinking of this story as well, I think. Any other questions? Second row from the front. So you're saying you use Ruby on Rails, and here you learned about what's happening in the background of Rubies. So this kind of knowledge, does it have any impact on you, like change your way of thinking or the mindset when you use the Rails as well?
So I'm someone who, I didn't study computer science. I did a boot camp, and one of the things that they teach you is Rails. And in my first job, consulting job, which was at Pivotal as a software engineer, the team that I was working from had to go from Ruby to Go. And it was when I started using Go that I realized just how much you take for granted or don't really understand your tools when you could use a framework like Rails all the time. And I remember also that there were so many things that I'd never really thought about, like garbage collection or like things like performance, or just things that I never had to really worry about. And so one of the reasons, like having this knowledge of like the internals of Ruby, I think it just means, and actually also working on further products, particularly when you start thinking about things like scale or bugs, it just means that it's easier for me to like self-service or to figure things out by myself, and also just to be less intimidated or also to understand like the scope of the domain, if that makes sense. Like if you don't really know much about the language behind the framework, you're just limited to, okay, this thing went wrong in Rails, but maybe it's not a Rails thing, maybe it's a Ruby thing. And digging into like the internals, playing around with things like object space just widens the domain area, gives you more confidence to play around and fix things, and maybe also discover ways to improve the frameworks that you're working with, because ultimately they're based on the language. But I also hope that in this talk, one of the messages I try and get across is this idea of like not just settling for like the frameworks that give you things for free, like digging into the things behind it to understand, because that can give anyone a new idea to like either to improve the language or the framework. And we're using all these things every day, and I just think it's a shame that a lot of us don't necessarily know details about how these things function. I hope that answered your question.
Well, thank you very much. Yes, thank you. Thank you very much. Any other questions? Well, if no questions for now, we finish up this session. And again, if you think of any questions later, and you can ask her that later. So thank you very much for the wonderful presentation, Nadia-san. Thank you very much for a wonderful presentation.